All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming back to part 2 of our occurrence and SOAR investigation and just culture workshop. And once again, I'd just give you some house rules for tonight. We actually have some polls tonight for a couple of the questions, as opposed to last time we did it, we had to collect them manually. So we'll have the responses come up on the polls. We also, if you're doing Q&As or questions or anything like that, put it in the Q&A icon that you've got in your meeting, and you can use the chat for other things if you need to as well, but for questions and answers, put them there so it's much easier for me to find and bring to Chris's attention. Having said all that, I'm going to introduce our presenter and course leader for tonight. So everybody knows Chris Thorpe. He was the former Executive Manager of Operations for Gliding Australia, and he has an extensive experience in safety, aviation safety, training, and gliding operations management. Over to you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to move into the second part of the SOAR investigation and just culture workshop. So in that first presentation, we focused mainly on immediate response to an occurrence, protecting the evidence, reporting, avoiding premature judgment, and establishing the right conditions for an investigation to begin properly. Tonight, we move beyond that initial response phase. The focus now is accident analysis, organisational learning, and long-term safety improvement. In simple terms, we are moving from the question, what happened, to the more difficult question, why did it happen, and what can we learn from it? A recurring theme tonight will be that most aviation accidents are not caused by one isolated mistake. They usually result from a combination of factors: operational, environmental, organisational, cultural, and human. A pilot may make a final visible error, but that error may have been shaped by workload, weather, supervision, training history, local expectations, radio congestion, fatigue, or pressure to continue. If we stop at the final action, we may miss the real safety learning. Modern investigation philosophy is not about excusing unsafe behaviour, it's about understanding behaviour in context. A learning-focused investigation still expects accountability and professionalism, but it also recognises that people operate inside systems. And it's those systems can either support good decisions or make poor decisions more likely. So tonight's presentation is about widening our field of view. Instead of asking only what did the pilot do wrong, we will also ask what conditions existed, what pressures were present, what barriers failed, what supervision was available, what local practices had become normal, and what could the organisation reasonably change to reduce the chance of recurrence. So understanding those interactions is what modern investigation philosophy is really about. So before moving forward, let's briefly revisit the key themes from the first presentation, because they provide the foundation for tonight's session. So last time we focused on the immediate response to an occurrence. That included why investigations matter, why organisations sometimes struggle with blame culture, how hindsight bias affects analysis, why early reporting matters, and why evidence preservation is so important. The first stage of an investigation is often time critical. Witness memories are freshest, physical evidence is still undisturbed, electronic records may still be available, weather and operational conditions can still be documented accurately. But as time passes, evidence can be lost, memories change, and assumptions may begin to replace facts. We also discussed several important investigation principles. The first was facts before assumptions. Investigators should not allow rumours, early opinions, or personal beliefs to become accepted as fact without supporting evidence. The second was learning before blame. The purpose of a safety investigation is not to determine guilt or innocence. It is to understand why an occurrence developed and what can be done to reduce the likelihood of recurrence. Then the third was systems thinking. While the pilot's actions are often visible, those actions usually occur within a wider operational environment involving procedures, supervision, equipment, culture, training, communication, and environmental conditions. Collecting evidence is only the beginning. The real challenge is interpreting that evidence correctly, understanding why the events unfolded as it did, and identifying lessons that genuinely improve safety. That process, moving from what happened to why it happened, is the focus of tonight's presentation. The early stages of an investigation focus heavily on establishing the facts. That means gathering evidence, building a timeline, obtaining witness accounts, preserving records, and reconstructing the sequence of events as accurately as possible. This is the what happened stage. It asks questions such as what aircraft was involved, who was operating it, what was the flight or ground activity, where did the event occur, what was the weather, what radio calls were made, what did witnesses observe, what damage occurred, and what happened first, next, and last. That stage is essential. Without a reliable understanding of what happened, any later analysis is likely to be weak. But factual reconstruction is not the end of the investigation. It's only the foundation. Eventually, investigators must move beyond what happened to the more difficult question, why did it happen? That transition is where many investigations either become genuinely useful or remain superficial. A report might accurately state the glider landed short, the aircraft entered a low circuit, the pilot failed to maintain directional control, or the launch continued despite a wing drop. Those statements may describe the event, but they do not yet explain it. They do not tell us what conditions shaped the pilot's performance. They do not tell us whether supervision, training, procedures, workload, communication, environmental conditions, or local operating norms played a role. Simply identifying the final visible error rarely improves safety very much. Professional investigations must therefore explore the wider context. They ask what pressures existed, what barriers should have prevented the event, were those barriers missing, were they weak or were they not used, were procedures clear and practical, were people trained and supervised appropriately, were human limitations such as fatigue, workload, distraction, or stress relevant? And were there organisational factors that made the event more likely? Understanding what happened describes the event. Understanding why it happened helped prevent it from happening again. Modern aviation philosophy recognises that accidents rarely result from one single isolated cause. When an accident occurs, the final event is often very visible. A pilot lands short, a glider ground loops, an aircraft joins incorrectly, a circuit continues when it should have been stopped, a radio call is missed. Those things are easy to see and they often attract most of the attention. But the visible event is usually only the end of the chain. If we only examine the final action, we may miss the conditions that made that action more likely. Accidents typically emerge from combinations of latent system weaknesses, operational pressures, human limitations, environmental conditions, and failed barriers. Now, latent conditions are weaknesses that may exist quietly in the background for a long time. They might include unclear procedures, informal training practices, poor supervision arrangements, weak reporting culture, outdated documentation, or local habits that have drifted away from the intended standard. On their own, these conditions may not cause an accident, but they create vulnerability. Operational pressures then add another layer. These might include a busy launch point, a crowded circuit, a shortage of instructors, deteriorating weather, fatigue late in the day, or pressure to keep training moving. Again, none of these factors necessarily cause an accident by itself, but each can reduce margins. Then we have human actions and decisions. These are often the most visible part of the chain, but they should not be examined in isolation. People make decisions based on what they perceive, what they understand, what they expect, and what they have been trained to do, and what pressures are acting on them at the time. That does not remove personal responsibility, but it does mean that a useful investigation asks why the decision made sense or seemed acceptable in that moment. In many accidents, the question is not just what did the pilot do? It is also what barrier should have caught this? Was the barrier missing? Was it weak? Was it ignored? Was it impractical? Or had the organisation become used to operating without it? That is why one of the most dangerous investigation mistakes is oversimplification. Statements such as pilot error caused the accident may feel simple and decisive, but they often explain very little operationally. A better investigation asks, why was the error possible? What conditions made it more likely? What barriers failed? What organisational influences existed? And could the same thing happen to someone else? If the answer is yes, then the investigation has identified a system risk, not merely an individual failure. The accident is the end of the chain. Prevention requires understanding and strengthening the whole chain. Investigators should examine multiple categories of contributing factors. A useful starting point is to separate them into three broad groups: individual factors, environmental factors, and organisational factors. This does not mean every occurrence will have something significant in every category. It simply gives investigators a structured way to avoid looking too narrowly at the final action. Individual factors relate to the people directly involved. These may include fatigue, workload, situational awareness, cognitive bias, distraction, or skill limitations. For example, a pilot may have been tired, overloaded, distracted by radio traffic, or slow to recognise that the aircraft was no longer where they expected it to be. But identifying a human factor is not the same as blaming the individual. If workload was high, we need to ask why. If situational awareness was reduced, we need to ask what information was available, what was competing for attention, and whether the operating environment made awareness more difficult. Environmental factors are the external conditions surrounding the operation. These may include weather, terrain, operational complexity, traffic, and time pressures. In gliding, these factors can change quickly. Wind strength, wind direction, sink, thermal activity, circuit traffic, launch activity, radio congestion, and competing operational priorities can all affect decision making. The point is not simply to list the weather or say the day was busy. The question is how those conditions influence people and operations. Did the environment increase workload? Did it reduce margins? Did it require decisions that exceeded the pilot's experience? Or did it make supervision more difficult? On the organisational factors side, these factors are often the most important, but also the easiest to miss. These include supervision, communication, training culture, procedural clarity, and operational expectations. They may exist well before the occurrence itself. For example, a club may not have a clear expectation about monitoring recently solo pilots in changing conditions. Launch point briefings may vary between instructors. Radio procedures may be informal. People may be reluctant to challenge experienced pilots. Or a shortcut may have become normal because it has worked many times before. A good investigation asks what was happening with the individual, what was happening in the environment, what was happening within the organisation, and most importantly, how did those factors interact? Accidents rarely occur because one factor existed in isolation. They occur when several factors combine, reduce margins, weaken barriers, and make an unwanted outcome more likely. One of the most important developments in modern aviation safety has been a change in the way we think about human performance. Historically, investigations often focused almost entirely on the individual. If a pilot made an error, the investigation frequently ended up with the conclusion that the accident was caused by pilot error. Today, we recognise that this explanation is usually incomplete. Human performance does not occur in isolation. People operate within systems, and those systems strongly influence the decisions they make, the actions they take, and the outcomes that occur. That does not mean people are simply product of the system, and it does not remove individual responsibility. It means every decision is made within an operational context. That context includes the organisation, the processes and policies, equipment and technology, the operating environment, culture, communication, supervision, workload, fatigue, stress, and operational pressure. The quality of that context can either support good performance or make errors more likely. So as investigators, we therefore ask not only what decisions did the pilot make, we also ask what conditions existed that influenced that decision. Workload is one example. Every pilot has a finite amount of mental capacity. When workload is low, there is spare capacity available to monitor the aircraft, think ahead, anticipate developing situations, and detect small errors before they become significant. As workload increases, that spare capacity disappears. Eventually, people focus only on the task immediately in front of them, and other important information may be missed. Fatigue, that also affects performance. When people become fatigued, attention narrows, reaction times increase, memory becomes less reliable, and cues that would normally be recognised may be missed. Stress also influences performance. A moderate level of stress can improve concentration, but excessive stress narrows attention and makes decision-making less flexible. Communication also matters. Poor communication is not limited to misunderstandings over the radio. It includes incomplete briefings, assumptions that someone else has understood, ambiguous terminology, failure to challenge unsafe behaviour, and information that never reaches the people who need it. Supervision is equally important. Good supervision provides support, monitoring, and timely intervention. Weak supervision does not necessarily mean someone failed to do their job. Sometimes supervisors themselves are overloaded, responsibilities are unclear, or there are too many competing priorities. Operational pressure is another factor investigators should consider. Pressure may come from time constraints, weather, training schedules, competition, or simply a desire to keep activities moving efficiently. Under pressure, people sometimes accept shortcuts they would normally reject. Good systems make safe behaviour easier. Poor systems make safe behaviour more difficult. This is why modern investigators try to understand behaviour rather than simply judge it. The system's view of human performance forms a basis for one of aviation's most useful human factors frameworks, the Shell model, which we'll look at next. The Shell model provides a structured way of examining the interaction between people and the operating system surrounding them. So rather than focusing solely on the individual, it encourages us to look at procedures, equipment, environment, communication, supervision, and organisational influence. It is a practical framework for understanding why people perform as they do and for identifying improvements that strengthen the whole system. Now, what we'll do is we'll pause the presentation for a few minutes and we'll apply the ideas we've just now discussed. So up until now, we've been talking about investigation principles in a fairly general way. So this exercise gives us a simple scenario to practice applying those ideas. The purpose is not to determine the cause of the accident. It is not to decide who was at fault, and it is certainly not to criticise the pilot. The purpose is to practice disciplined investigation thinking. As investigators, our first responsibility is not to reach conclusions. Our first responsibility is to identify the questions that need to be answered. Good investigators ask themselves, what could have influenced this? What information is missing? What assumptions am I making? And what evidence would I need before reaching a conclusion? So please take a few minutes to read the scenario on the slide. Okay. So before we discuss the scenario, I'm going to launch Dave's going to launch a quick Teams poll.
Okay, Chris, I'll launch it now, and it should appear in your chat channel.
Okay, so looking only at the information provided, what is the most appropriate initial investigation approach? And the options are focus primarily on the pilot's actions, focus primarily on environmental conditions, focus primarily on organisational factors, or examine all three categories before reaching conclusions.
Okay. So we've had 4 responses. 5. And we have 1 in the chat panel.
Yeah.
Few in the chat panel, so a lot more in the chat panel.
Yeah, I think we could probably move on
Yeah,
from that.
I'll close it down, Chris. It looks
Yeah,
like, yeah.
yeah,
There we go.
it's unanimous.
The correct answer is, you're going to say, Chris?
Yeah, so the correct answer is examine all three categories before reaching conclusions. It was a bit of a no-brainer, that one, I think. But that is the key point of this exercise. At this early stage, we should not decide that this was simply a pilot issue, an environmental issue, or an organisational issue. We are looking for possible contributing factors and areas for inquiry. At this early stage, we should not be deciding that this was simply a pilot issue. Sorry, I just said that, didn't I? So we're looking for possible contributing factors. We have a club single-seat glider that lands heavily short of the marked landing area during a busy training day. The pilot is recently solo, has limited experience in variable wind conditions, and has been soaring nearby before returning to the circuit. The circuit was flown lower than normal. The radio was busy. Several instructors were occupied with the other training activities. The duty instructor believed the pilot was coping well and did not intervene. During the previous 30 minutes, the wind had shifted and strengthened. The pilot was not injured, but the glider sustained undercarriage and fuselage damage. And now it would be easy to say the pilot flew a low circuit or the pilot misjudged the landing. Those statements may eventually prove to be partly true, but they are descriptions, not explanations. They tell us what happened. They do not tell us why it happened. At this stage, our task is to identify possible contributing factors, not conclusions. A useful way to begin to consider these broad headings: individual factors, environmental factors, and organisational factors. So if we start with the individual, what factors associated with a pilot might have influenced performance? Experience is the one obvious consideration in this case. A recently solo pilot is still developing judgment and may have limited experience recognising changing wind conditions. Workload is another. Had the pilot been soaring for some time? Were they mentally tired? Were they trying to monitor traffic, listen to a busy radio, judge the wind, and plan the circuit all at once? Situational awareness is also relevant. Did the pilot recognise that the circuit was becoming low? Did they understand the effects of changing wind? Or did they recognise the problem when recovery options were already limited? These are not conclusions. They are questions that deserve investigation. Now, if we consider the environment, the wind had shifted and strengthened. The radio was busy. The operation was active. Those factors may have increased workload and reduced the pilot's spare capacity. A wind change that an experienced pilot manages comfortably may be much more demanding for someone recently solo. A busy radio can also make it harder to absorb information, especially when the pilot is already under pressure. Now we can consider organisational factors. This is often where the most useful learning is found. The duty instructor believed the pilot was coping well and did not intervene. That may have been reasonable at the time, or it may reveal a supervision issue. We cannot assume either way without more evidence. An investigator should ask, how was that judgment made? Was the instructor supervising several activities at once? Was anyone specifically monitoring recently solo pilots? Were instructors discussing the strengthening wind? Was there a clear trigger for limiting solo flying as conditions changed? And was the pilot operating within an agreed early solo envelope? These questions examine the system around the pilot rather than just the pilot's final action. The key lesson from this exercise is that even a relatively simple landing accident may involve several interacting factors. If the investigation stops at the pilot misjudged the landing, the organisation may have missed important learning about supervision, workload, changing weather, communication, training, and operational risk management. A useful investigation asks not only what did the pilot do, it also asks what conditions shaped the pilot's performance. Now, I just noticed there were a few pop-ups coming up while I was reading that. Dave, was there anything serious in that?
No, it's people just working through the logistics of the poll. I think it's to do with some people are using the web version of Teams, and that may not work well with polls, as far as I've worked out. So that
Okay.
could be it. Yeah.
All right. Well, if they can stop using the chat, and it keeps popping up and distracting me.
Yeah. Gotcha.
All right. So we've now reached one of the most widely used human factors models in aviation safety investigation. It is known as the Shell model. It is a fairly simple model, but it is a very useful way of keeping an investigation broad and systematic. Its purpose is to help investigators analyse how people interact with the systems around them. So instead of asking only what did the pilot do, the Shell model encourages us to ask, how well did the person fit within the system that surrounds them? That is a very different question. So at the centre of the model is the person performing the task. The key idea is that performance is shaped by interactions between all Shell components, not by any one component in isolation. Each connection between the person and the surrounding system is an interface. Accidents often occur when one or more of these interfaces is weak, unclear, overloaded, or poorly matched. The letters in Shell represent 5 parts of the operational system. Software refers to procedures, rules, plans, information, checklists, operating manuals, local rules, training material, briefings, and organisational policies. Hardware refers to physical equipment, including aircraft, instruments, radios, tow ropes, launch equipment, cockpit layout, and anything else the operator uses or interacts with. Environment includes both the physical environment and the operational environment. That means weather, wind, terrain, lighting, noise, operational tempo, traffic density, workload, and the general conditions in which the operation is taking place. Live wire refers to the individual person. In our context, that may be the pilot, an instructor, a wing runner, a launch marshal, a tug pilot, or even the investigator. Finally, live wire to live wire examines the interaction between people. This includes communication, teamwork, supervision, leadership, coordination, briefings, shared understanding, and the willingness of people to speak up when something does not look right. One of the reasons the Shell model is so useful is that it shifts attention away from isolated events and towards the interfaces between people and the systems they operate within. Those relationships often explain why an occurrence became possible. For example, an experienced pilot may still make an error if procedures are unclear. A capable instructor may struggle if supervision responsibilities are excessive. A well-trained pilot may make a poor decision if workload becomes overwhelming. A perfectly serviceable aircraft may still contribute to an occurrence if cockpit ergonomics make important information difficult to interpret. None of these examples mean that any single component is defective. The point is that accidents often arise from mismatches between the person and the system. The Shell model helps investigators ask better questions. Could procedures have been clearer? Was the equipment suitable? Did environmental conditions increase workload? Did communication work effectively? Did supervision support safe decision making? Were organisational expectations realistic? Were the interfaces between the person and the system working effectively? The model should not be treated as a mechanical checklist. It is a way of thinking. It encourages curiosity. It helps investigators look beyond the obvious and reduces the chance that significant areas of inquiry will be missed. So what we'll now do is we'll look at each shell component individually. We'll begin with software. In the shell model, software does not mean computer software. It means the non-physical parts of the operational system that guide how people perform their work. And as I mentioned before, that includes procedures, checklists, operations manuals, training guidance, local operating rules, briefing material, safety notices, risk management processes, and sometimes unwritten expectations that have become accepted within the organisation. Software tells people what should be done, when it should be done, and how it should be done. Good software provides consistency. To be effective, it needs to be clear, practical, current, and understood. It reduces uncertainty. It supports decision making, and it establishes common expectations across the organisation. Procedures are especially valuable when people are under pressure. They reduce the amount of decision making that has to occur in real time. So instead of asking, what should I do now? People already know the expected process. But simply having procedures is not enough. Investigators should ask, were the procedures clear? Were they practical? Were they current? Were they understood? And did local actual practice differ from documented procedure? The last question is particularly important. Many organisations develop small differences between what is written and what actually happens on the airfield. Sometimes those differences are sensible adaptations to local conditions, but sometimes they become unsafe workarounds. Briefings become shorter, checks are combined, documentation is bypassed, or local customs gradually replace formal procedures. Eventually, nobody recognised that a difference exists. This is sometimes described as the gap between work as imagined and work as done. Work as imagined is what the manual says. Work as done is what actually happens in normal operations. A mismatch between procedure and practice does not automatically mean people are deliberately ignoring rules. Often, people are trying to make the operation more efficient or more practical. The problem is that each small adaptation may reduce a safety margin without anyone immediately recognising it. For example, a written procedure may require a proper launch briefing whenever conditions change. Initially, everybody complies. But over time, as people become more familiar with the operation, the briefing becomes shorter. Eventually, someone simply says, same as before. Nobody intends to reduce safety, but an important opportunity to identify changing hazards has quietly disappeared. The same can happen with checklists. Experienced pilots may know a checklist from memory. That experience is useful, but the purpose of a checklist is to catch the occasional item that memory misses. Good investigations therefore examine not only whether procedures existed, but whether they remained effective. Were they realistic? Were they being followed? If not, why not? Did supervisors know how work was actually being done? And was there a process for reviewing procedures against real operational practice? When software is not clear or practical, current and understood, procedures may become a little more than documents on a shelf while people develop their own informal ways of working. That is why investigators examine how procedures influence decisions and actions, not merely whether a rule existed. The next component of the shell model is hardware. Hardware refers to the physical components of the operational system. In gliding, this includes the aircraft itself, but it extends much further than that. It includes instruments, radios, seats, controls, tow release, canopy, launch equipment, trailers, batteries, maintenance condition, and cockpit layout. In simple terms, if it is something a person uses, operates, reads, or physically interacts with, it forms part of the hardware element. Many people assume hardware means mechanical failure. Mechanical defects are certainly one possibility, but human factors investigations looks more broadly than that. The important question is not simply, was the equipment defective? The more useful question is, how did the equipment support or hinder the person using it? An aircraft may be completely airworthy. Every instrument may function exactly as designed. Maintenance may be entirely satisfactory, yet the equipment may still contribute to an occurrence because of the way people interact with it. Cockpit ergonomics are one example. Can the pilot comfortably reach all the controls? Can critical switches be distinguished easily? Can important instruments be scanned without excessive head movement? Is the cockpit layout helping the pilot or adding to workload? Visibility is another consideration. No cockpit provides unrestricted vision in every direction. Canopy frames, wing position, seating height, and aircraft attitude can all create blind spots. An investigator should ask whether cockpit design influenced the pilot's ability to detect traffic, judge the landing area, or maintain awareness. Instrumentation also matters. Modern cockpits can provide a lot of useful information, but information that is hard to locate or interpret can increase workload. A radio may function perfectly from a technical perspective, but poor audio quality, cockpit noise, or a complicated control layout may still make communication difficult under pressure. Similarly, a tow release may work exactly as designed, but if it is awkward to reach during a high-stress situation, that interface deserves attention. Hardware also includes equipment around the aircraft, launch equipment, tow ropes, ground handling equipment, trailers, radio systems, runway markers, and airfield lighting. One useful question is, did the hardware make the task easier or harder? Good equipment supports safe operation. It is reliable, usable, and suited to operational demands. It reduces workload. It communicates information clearly. It is intuitive to use, and it remains reliable under operational conditions. On the other hand, poorly designed or poorly arranged equipment, even when technically serviceable, can increase workload and reduce safety margins. Another useful question is, would another competent person have experienced the same difficulty? If the answer is yes, the issue may not lie with the individual. It may indicate that the equipment or its design contributed to the occurrence. The objective is not simply to determine whether something was broken. It is to understand how the physical system influenced decisions, actions, and outcomes. The next component of the shell model is environment. When investigators hear the word environment, the first thought is usually weather. Weather is certainly part of the environment, but in human factors analysis, the concept is broader. Environment includes both the physical conditions and the operational context in which people are working. It is everything around the individual that influences how demanding the task becomes. A useful question is, what demands was the operational environment placing on the people involved? The physical environment includes wind strength, wind direction, turbulence, thermal activity, cloud, visibility, terrain, obstacles, lighting, temperature, runway surface condition, and other physical features of the operating area. In gliding, these conditions can change quickly. A day that was suitable 30 minutes ago may become more demanding as the wind shifts, as thermal activity changes, sink develops, or visibility reduces. Those changes may seem minor to an experienced pilot, but they can significantly increase workload for someone with limited experience. The operational environment is equally important. This includes traffic density, launch activity, radio congestion, competition or event operations, time pressure, distractions, noise, interruptions, and the overall pace of the operation. Imagine a recently solo pilot returning to land. The weather is acceptable. The aircraft is functioning normally, but the launch point is busy. Several aircraft are operating in the circuit. The radio frequency is congested. A tug is preparing to depart. Another instructor is conducting a lesson. Nothing is necessarily unsafe in isolation, but collectively, the operational environment has become more demanding. As demands increase, the spare mental capacity available to monitor, anticipate, and detect errors reduces. Pilots may become focused on one task while unintentionally overlooking another. That is why relatively small environmental changes can have significant effect on decision making. Investigators therefore need to examine not only the conditions themselves, but how those conditions interacted with the people involved. A strengthening crosswind may be routine for an experienced pilot, but demanding for someone recently solo. A busy radio may be manageable for one pilot, but distracting to another. Operational pressure also matters. Pressure does not always come from someone telling a pilot to hurry. It may be self-imposed. A pilot may want to complete the flight before conditions deteriorate. An instructor may want to keep training moving. A club may be managing many flights during a busy day. Those pressures are usually well-intentioned, but they can still influence decisions. So the key question is not simply, was the weather good? The better question is, how demanding was the operational environment at the time? The purpose of analysing environment is to understand how environmental conditions interacted with people, their procedures and equipment, and how they shaped human performance, decisions, and safety margins. The fourth component of the shell model is live wire. Live wire refers to the individual human being performing the tasks, so the pilot in this case. In aviation, that may be the pilot, instructor, tug aircraft, airfield operator, wing runner, launch marshal, or anyone else directly involved. At first glance, this may seem like the part of the investigation where we focus on pilot error. In reality, it is almost the opposite. Modern human factors analysis is not about finding fault with individuals. It is about understanding how capable people perform within the conditions and constraints of the operational system. Humans are remarkably adaptable, but they also have natural limitations. Every day, pilots deal with changing weather, unexpected traffic, equipment issues, workload, and operational complexity. That adaptability is essential to aviation. But human adaptability has limits. People become fatigued. They become overloaded. They become distracted. They become stressed. Attention shifts. Memory fails. Information is overlooked. And sometimes, with hindsight, decisions turn out to have been very poor. These are not automatically signs of incompetence. They are normal characteristics of human performance. Fatigue is a good example. It affects far more than physical tiredness. It reduces attention, it slows reaction time, it affects judgment, and makes it harder to process multiple pieces of information at once. Importantly, people are often poor judges of their own fatigue. Stress has a similar effect. Moderate stress can sharpen concentration, but excessive stress narrows attention. People focus on the immediate problem and may miss the broader situation. Situational awareness is another key issue. It is not simply knowing where the aircraft is. It is understanding what is happening now, anticipating what is likely to happen next, and recognising when the situation is changing. Situational awareness can be lost gradually. A pilot may focus on one aircraft and miss another. They may concentrate on the landing area and fail to appreciate a strengthening crosswind. They may become absorbed in solving one problem while another develops. Decision making is also important. After an accident, it is easy to ask, why did they make that decision? But the investigator's task is different. We ask, given the information available at the time, why might that decision have appeared reasonable? That question helps us avoid hindsight bias. People generally make the best decisions they can based on the information available, their training, experience, time available, and the pressures acting on them. Sometimes that decision proves wrong. Understanding why it seemed reasonable at the time is where the real learning often lies. So investigators should therefore ask, what conditions shaped performance? What information was actually available? What pressures existed? How reasonable did the actions appear in the circumstances? And what human strengths were supporting performance? And that last question is often forgotten. People usually do many things correctly before an occurrence develops. They recognise hazards, they solve problems, they adapt successfully. Understanding what worked well can be just as valuable as understanding what did not. The key point is this. Good human factors investigations avoid blaming individuals and instead focus on understanding the person within the system. Making an error does not automatically indicate negligence, carelessness, or incompetence. The purpose of examining Livewire is to understand how a capable person responded to the conditions, information, and constraints that existed at the time. That understanding helps identify improvements in training, procedures, supervision, and organisational systems so that the next person is better supported. Final component is the Livewire to Livewire. This element examines the interaction between people. Aviation is rarely an individual activity. Even when one person is flying the aircraft, that pilot is usually operating within a wider network of human interactions. In gliding operations especially, successful flying depends on teamwork. Pilots interact with instructors, students interact with supervisors, launch crews coordinate with wing runners, tow pilots communicate with ground personnel, pilots share the circuit with other aircraft. Throughout the day, people are exchanging information, making decisions, supervising each other, and influencing one another's behaviour. The quality of those interactions has a direct effect on safety. Strong, clear, and respectful interactions support safe and effective operations. When communication is clear, when supervision is effective, and people feel comfortable speaking up, the system becomes more resilient. When communication breaks down, supervision becomes inconsistent, or people hesitate to question developing problems. The likelihood of an occurrence increases. This is why the Livewire to Livewire interface deserves careful attention. One important area is the relationship between instructors and students. Training is about much more than aircraft handling. It also shapes judgment, decision-making, attitudes to risk, and operational habits. Students learn not only from what instructors say, but also from what instructors do. If instructors model disciplined decision-making and respect for procedures, those behaviours are likely to be adopted. If shortcuts become normal during training, those shortcuts may become embedded. Communication is another critical interface. This includes radio communication, but it also includes briefings, discussions about weather, clarification of procedures, confirmation that instructions have been understood, and sharing concerns about changing conditions. Many investigations reveal that information was available somewhere in the organisation, but never reached the person who needed it most. Perhaps someone noticed the wind strengthening, but assumed everyone else had noticed. Perhaps an instructor believed another instructor was supervising a particular pilot. Perhaps a pilot misunderstood a radio call, but was reluctant to seek clarification. These are all communication failures, even if no radio failed. Task delegation and role clarity are also important. Who is supervising recently solo pilots? Who is monitoring the weather? Who is responsible for launch sequencing? Who is making operational decisions when conditions begin changing? If responsibilities are unclear, people may assume someone else is managing the situation. Good organisations make responsibilities explicit. Peer influence is another important factor. People are influenced by those around them, often without realising it. If experienced pilots continue flying in marginal conditions, newer pilots may assume that doing so is normal. If everyone ignores a checklist item, the next person is likely to do the same. If questioning decisions is discouraged, people will become less willing to speak up. Unsafe practices are rarely invented by one individual. More often, they evolve gradually through repeated social reinforcement. People observe what is accepted, what is rewarded, what is criticised, and what is ignored. Over time, those observations shape what becomes regarded as normal. This is why investigators should look beyond the technical facts of the occurrence and examine the human relationships around it. Were concerns openly discussed? Did people feel able to challenge decisions? Was communication respectful and effective? Were responsibilities understood? Did the culture encourage openness and learning? Or did it unintentionally discourage people from raising concerns? The Livewire to Livewire interface reminds us that people do not simply operate aircraft, they operate within communities. Strong, respectful, professional interactions create one of the most powerful safety defences any organisation can have. So now that we've examined each component of the shell model individually, we'll now move on to applying this. So the real strength of the model is not that it divides an investigation into 5 separate categories. Its real value is that it helps investigators understand how those categories interact. Accidents rarely occur because one part of the system fails completely. Instead, they usually occur because several parts of the system influence one another in ways that gradually reduce safety margins. That is why the person remains at the centre of the shell model. People do not operate independently. Every decision they make is influenced by procedures, equipment, environmental conditions, and the people around them. So if you imagine a recently solo pilot, the pilot's judgment, experience, workload, and situation awareness all influence their performance. Now we introduce the environment. The wind strengthens, traffic increases, the radio becomes busy. Immediately, workload increases. Now consider software. Are club procedures clear about operating limits for recently solo pilots? Is there guidance for instructors about changing weather? Is there a trigger for reviewing conditions before further launches continue? Now consider the live wire to live wire. Was the pilot briefed about the changing conditions? Did instructors discuss whether operations should continue? Was supervision appropriate? Finally, consider hardware. Was the radio easy to hear? Was visibility adequate? Did the aircraft's handling characteristics become more demanding in the stronger wind? So have you noticed what happened? None of these factors exist independently. The environment changes, that affects workload. Higher workload changes how the pilot interacts with procedures. Communication becomes more important. Supervision becomes more demanding. Everything becomes connected. This is why investigators should not examine factors one at a time. They should ask, how did these different parts of the system interact? When the interfaces fit together well, the system is resilient. Clear procedures support good decisions. Appropriate equipment reduces workload. Good supervision catches developing problems. Effective communication ensures shared understanding. Reasonable environmental conditions allow people to operate within their capabilities. But if several interfaces weaken at the same time, safety margins shrink. Procedures may be unclear. The weather may change. The radio may become congested. Supervisors may be busy elsewhere. The pilot may be inexperienced. Individually, none of these issues may cause an accident. Collectively, they may significantly increase the risk. The key investigation questions are, which interfaces contributed? Which barriers failed? What system interactions mattered? And how did they reduce safety margins? And could the same conditions occur again? And that final question is critical. If another pilot could reasonably encounter the same conditions, the investigation has identified an opportunity to improve the system. That might involve better procedures, additional training, improved supervision, clearer communication, revised operating limits, or better awareness of how risks interact. The shell model helps us move beyond saying the pilot should have been more careful. Instead, it asks, what can we improve so the next pilot is less likely to encounter the same circumstances? That is the essence of modern safety investigation. Now, let's apply the shell model to another practical scenario. So the previous exercise introduced the idea of looking beyond the obvious event. This exercise goes one step further by organising possible contributing factors using the shell framework. The purpose is not to find the correct answer. The purpose is to think systematically and avoid overlooking important interactions between people, procedures, equipment, and the operating environment. So please take a few moments to read the scenario on the slide. All right, before we work through the scenario, I'm going to launch, or again, Dave's going to launch the quick Teams poll. So,
yep. I'll launch the poll and also do a paste into the chat panel of the questions for those who are on the web version. So here's the launch happening now.
So what we're looking for, which shell elements seem most relevant based on the information available? So I think the poll will allow you to select up to 2 options, and the options are software, hardware, environment, live wire to live wire.
Okay, we've got a few responses in there.
Okay, so what's the results that we've got there, Dave?
Well, so far we've the most is coming through as environment,
Yep.
and equal with livewire, liveware to liveware.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
there's no single correct answer here. We would expect many people to identify liveware environment or liveware to liveware because the scenario includes student handling, instructor workload, a busy launch point, crosswind, wing runner experience, communication, and stop call culture. Some may also identify software because the briefing procedures appear informal and may vary between instructors. Fewer people may select hardware, but it still deserves consideration. We should still ask whether the aircraft, tow release, radio, cockpit layout, visibility, or other physical equipment supported safe performance. The important point is that the spread of responses is part of the learning. Different investigators may notice different parts of the system first, but a thorough investigation should eventually consider all 5 shell elements and how they interact. The scenario describes the 2-seat training glider on aerotow. Shortly after becoming airborne, the glider develops a significant wing drop. The instructor takes control, releases from tow at low level and lands ahead. No one's injured, but the glider sustains minor damage. At first glance, it would be easy to say the student allowed the wing to drop. That may describe part of what happened, but it does not explain enough. The better question is, why did the situation develop in the way it did? So let's look at the information available. The student had previously shown inconsistent rudder coordination. The launch point was busy and slightly rushed. The wing runner was inexperienced. There was a light crosswind. The instructor had been flying continuously for several hours. The club's launch briefing procedure was informal and varied between instructors. The tug pilot later reported that the glider appeared to yaw or drift out of alignment during the early part of the takeoff roll. And despite those developing cues, no one stopped the launch. Already we can see there is more here than simply wing drop after liftoff. So if we apply the shell model, software first, software includes the procedures, the briefing, the training guidance, local rules and operating practices. Relevant questions might include, did the club have a standard launch briefing? Was there a clear process for assessing student readiness? Were wing runners trained consistently? Was there a shared understanding of crosswind limits? Did everyone understand who had authority to stop a launch? And had different instructors developed different ways of conducting launches? These questions do not assume a procedural failure. They identify possible mismatches or gaps for inquiry. Now we consider the hardware. Was the aircraft functioning normally? Were the controls operating correctly? Was the tow release accessible? Was the tow rope suitable? Was radio communication effective? Could cockpit ergonomics or visibility have influenced the instructor's workload? Again, we're not assuming a mechanical defect. We are asking whether the physical system supported safe performance or whether there was a mismatch between the equipment and the task. Now we consider the environment. There was a light crosswind. The launch point was busy. Operations were slightly rushed. There was activity around the launch area. The physical weather may not have been particularly difficult, but the operational environment appears to have been demanding. Busy launch operations create distractions. Noise increases. People become task focused. Multiple aircraft and people require attention. Small changes in tempo can increase workload more than people realise. Now we can consider live wire. The student had previously shown inconsistent rudder coordination. That does not mean the student caused the occurrence. It means student readiness and workload deserve examination. How much recent experience did the student have? Had sufficient progress been demonstrated before flying in crosswind conditions? How much spare capacity remained after liftoff? The instructor had also been flying continuously for several hours. We should not automatically conclude that fatigue was significant, but we should ask whether continuous instructional flying increased workload or reduced alertness. Finally, if we consider live wire to live wire, how effective was communication between the student and instructor? Did the instructor have concerns before the launch? Were those concerns discussed? Was the ring runner sufficiently experienced to recognise developing problems? If the glider began yawing during the ground roll, did anyone notice? If they did they feel able to stop the launch? This final question is especially important. Many organisations say that anyone can call stop, but the practical question is, would an experienced person actually feel comfortable doing so under pressure? An inexperienced windrunner may hesitate because experienced instructors appear comfortable continuing. A junior member may assume someone else had seen the problem. Someone may worry about embarrassment if they stop a launch unnecessarily. These are normal human responses within social environments. So good investigations therefore ask not simply, could someone have stopped the launch? They ask, would someone in that situation have felt confident enough to do so? Now, if we take a moment to map the scenario against the 5 shell elements, hang on. Sorry about that, guys. I've duplicated something here. Okay. Sorry about that. I've managed to duplicate my notes. All right. So by examining procedures, equipment, environment, individual performance, and human interactions together, investigators are far more likely to identify meaningful improvements. Those improvements might involve better launch briefings, clearer stop call procedures, additional wing runner training, revised supervision practices, or changes to how instructors manage student launches in crosswind conditions. The exact recommendations will depend on the evidence, but the important point is this. The Shell model encourages us to look beyond the final event and understand the complete operational system. That systems perspective produces investigations that do more than explain what happened. It helps prevent similar occurrences in the future. So throughout this workshop, we've repeatedly returned to one central theme. Good investigations seek understanding before judgment. So this slide here explains why that principle is so important. So let's begin with something that is absolutely true. Pilots do make mistakes. So do instructors. So do engineers, launch crews, supervisors, and managers. Every person involved in aviation occasionally makes errors. Human error is real, it is unavoidable, and it is predictable. The question for investigators is not whether an error occurred. The question is whether identifying the error explains the accident. Very often it does not. A report might conclude the pilot flew too slowly, or the pilot selected the wrong field, or the pilot failed to maintain directional control. These statements may be factually correct. They describe what happened, but they usually do not explain why it happened. If the investigation ends there, it tells us little about how to prevent the next occurrence. This is what we mean by simplistic pilot blame. It focuses on the final visible action while ignoring everything that shaped that action. That is the difference shown on the right of the slide. Blame looks at the last action, the person at the end of the chain. A professional investigation looks wider. It asks how procedures, equipment, environment, training, supervision, communication, and human interactions combined to create risk. The first problem is that blame stops learning. Once we decide that the pilot caused the accident, there is often little motivation to continue asking questions. Were procedures clear? Was training adequate? Was supervision appropriate? Was equipment easy to use? Were operational pressures increasing workload? If we stop at the pilot, those questions remain unanswered. The second problem is that blame hides system weaknesses. Every organisation contains vulnerabilities. Some are obvious, others develop gradually. Procedures may become outdated. Supervision may become inconsistent. Instructor workload may increase. Unsafe shortcuts may become accepted. If the investigation focuses only on the individual, these weaknesses remain hidden. The next pilot may then encounter the same conditions. The third problem is that blame discourages reporting. People are less likely to report mistakes or near misses if they believe that process is mainly looking for someone to punish. Some may not report at all. Others may provide only limited information. Witnesses may become guarded. Over time, valuable safety information disappears. The fourth problem is that blame oversimplifies complex situations. Accidents usually develop through interactions between people, procedures, equipment, environment, supervision, communication, and organisational culture. Reducing the complexity to one person's final action may sound decisive, but it often removes the very information needed to prevent recurrence. That is why just culture is so important. People need confidence that honest reporting will lead to learning, not automatic punishment. That does not mean there is no accountability. It means accountability should be based on evidence and context. Understanding is not the same as excusing. Investigators are not seeking reasons to avoid accountability. They are seeking explanations that allow organisations to improve. A better question than who caused this is, why did a competent person operating within this particular system make that decision under those circumstances? That question almost always leads to better learning. It identifies improvements in procedures, training, supervision, equipment, communication, or organisational culture. Ultimately, this is why professional investigations seek understanding before judgment. That approach produces fairer investigations. More importantly, it produces safer aviation. One of the most important skills an investigator can develop is learning to ask better questions. The quality of an investigation is often determined by the quality of the questions being asked. Poor questions usually produce poor answers. Good questions lead investigators towards understanding. A casual observer often asks, who caused this? Or whose fault was it? Those questions are understandable. As human beings, we naturally look for simple explanations. But while those questions may satisfy curiosity, they rarely improve safety. Professional investigators ask different questions. The first is, why did this make sense? Or more fully, why did this action appear reasonable at the time? At first, that may sound strange. If an accident occurred, surely the decision did not make sense. But people generally make decisions that seem reasonable at the time based on information, experience, and context available to them. Investigators therefore try to understand the world from the perspective of the pilot involved. What information did they have? What did they believe was happening? What alternatives appeared available? What experience were they drawing on? And what context shaped that decision? This helps us avoid hindsight bias. Knowing the outcome makes earlier decisions appear obvious. The people involved did not have that advantage. The next question is, what pressures existed? These may include time pressure, workload, environmental pressures, operational pressures, or pressure to keep activities moving. Pressure does not excuse poor decisions, but it can help explain why a decision, shortcut, or delay may have been acceptable in the moment. Another important question is, what barriers failed? Aviation contains many layers of defence: training, supervision, procedures, equipment, checklists, briefings, communication, weather monitoring, and operational oversight. When an accident occurs, investigators should ask which barrier should have interrupted the chain of events. Did the barrier exist? Was it missing? Was it weak? Was it ineffective? Was it bypassed? Or was it overwhelmed by the circumstances? Another very useful question is, could others make the same mistake? This question changes the direction of an investigation. Instead of only focusing on one individual, it asks whether the system created conditions in which similar errors were likely. Imagine replacing the person involved with another competent person of similar experience. Would that person, operating under the same conditions, with the same information and the same pressures, have been vulnerable to making a similar decision? If the answer is yes, or even possibly yes, the investigation has identified a system issue. The final question on the left is, what organisational influences existed? Were procedures adequate? Was training appropriate? Was supervision effective? Were resources sufficient? Were expectations clearly communicated? Did organisational priorities unintentionally encourage risk? Did cultural norms influence behaviour? Now, if we look at the right side of the slide, All of those questions surround one central idea: seek understanding. That means looking beyond the final action. It means asking why the decision made sense, what pressures existed, what barriers failed, whether others could make the same mistake, and what organisational influences were present. Every question should move us closer to understanding rather than judgment. Understanding as to why something happened, understanding how factors interacted, understanding why people behaved as they did, and understanding what can be improved. If our questions continually lead us back to blame, we are probably asking the wrong questions. If they reveal new insights into the system, we are probably asking the right ones. Asking better questions does not just produce better reports, it produces safer organisations. One of the greatest threats to aviation safety is not dramatic or obvious. It develops quietly, gradually, almost unnoticed. It is the gradual acceptance of unsafe practices as though they were normal. This process is known as normalisation of deviance. It explains how otherwise competent organisations can slowly become less safe without anyone deliberately choosing to lower standards. Unsafe norms rarely begin with major decision. They usually begin with a small shortcut. Someone omits a checklist item because they have done the task hundreds of times. A launch proceeds in conditions that are slightly outside the club's preferred limits. A pilot joins circuit a little tighter than normal because the airfield is busy. Nothing bad happens. The shortcut appears harmless. The next time it happens again. Again, nothing bad happens. Others observe the behaviour. They assume that this is simply how things are done. Eventually, the shortcut no longer feels like a shortcut. It becomes normal. And that is the danger. The centre of the slide shows how this process develops. First, people follow the standard. Then a small shortcut saves time or effort. Others begin copying it. The behaviour becomes common. As it becomes accepted, safety barriers gradually weaken. Risk increases over time, even though nothing appears to have changed. Eventually, the wrong combination of conditions occurs and an incident exposes the reduced safety margin. When an occurrence is investigated later, people may honestly say, "We've always done it this way," or "Everybody does that." These comments are important clues. They suggest the investigation should not stop with the immediate event. It should ask how the practice became normal in the first place. In gliding operations, this pattern can appear in many ways. Marginal launches may become accepted because they have worked before. Lookout discipline may weaken because pilots assume the circuit is already clear. Briefings may become shorter during busy operations. Radio calls may become less disciplined. Local practices may drift away from documented procedures. Each change may seem minor, but together they can reduce safety margins. The investigator therefore needs to look beyond the shortcut itself. The questions on the right-hand side of the slide provide a useful guide. What behaviours were accepted within the local culture? What shortcuts or operational habits had become normal? Was supervision visible, consistent and effective? What messages were leaders sending through both their words and their actions? And what system weaknesses allowed these unsafe norms to persist? Unsafe norms are rarely created by one individual. They develop socially. New members learn by watching experienced members. Students learn from instructors. Visitors copy local practices. People pay attention to what is actually accepted, not what is written in procedures. This is why leadership has such a powerful influence on safety culture. People notice what leaders do. If experienced people take shortcuts, those actions may speak louder than any safety briefing. Very often, unsafe norms continue simply because nobody steps back and asks whether current practice still matches intended standards. That is why investigations should not focus only on the accident sequence. The accident may be the first visible sign of a problem that has been developing quietly for months or years. Unsafe norms do not appear overnight. They develop slowly through repeated successful operations. Each success reinforces the belief that the shortcut is acceptable. Then, when the wrong combination of conditions occurs, the weakened safety margin is exposed. The accident appears sudden. The cultural drift was not. Professional investigations therefore identify gradual changes in culture, challenge unsafe norms, reinforce professional standards, and strengthen organisational systems before a more serious event occurs. That is how we protect lives and prevent the next occurrence. Throughout this presentation, we've examined human performance, the Shell model, unsafe norms, and systems thinking. All of these topics lead us to one important conclusion. People do not operate in isolation. They operate within organisations, and the organisation itself has a significant influence on safety. When investigators hear the word organisation, they sometimes think only of senior management. In reality, organisational influence extends throughout the entire operation. Every instructor, duty pilot, launch marshal, committee member, and experienced club member contributes to the culture that newer members experience. Organisational culture is the collection of shared beliefs, behaviours, and expectations that develop over time. It answers questions such as, how do we normally do things here? What behaviour is encouraged? What behaviour is tolerated? And what behaviour is quietly ignored? Those answers shape operational decisions every day, often without people consciously recognising their influence. Leadership attitudes are one important influence. Leadership is about far more than issuing instructions. Leaders establish priorities. They influence behaviour through their own actions. They demonstrate what is genuinely important. People watch what leaders do more closely than they listen to what leaders say. A club may publish an excellent safety policy, but if experienced people routinely bypass procedures, accept unnecessary risks, or dismiss concerns, that behaviour can quickly become the real standard. Conversely, leaders who model good decision making, openly discuss mistakes, and encourage reporting establish a very different culture. Instructor standards also matter. Instructors influence far more than technical flying school. They shape professional attitudes, risk perception, decision making, operational discipline, communication habits, and safety culture. Students observe everything instructors do. If instructors consistently demonstrate professionalism, careful preparation, and disciplined decision making, those standards become embedded in future pilots. If instructors routinely accept shortcuts, those behaviours may also become embedded. Resource limitations are another reality. Every organisation operates within constraints. There may be limited instructors, limited funding, limited equipment, limited maintenance resources, limited time, or limited volunteers. These limitations do not automatically create unsafe operations, but they can create pressures that influence decision making. Limited instructors may increase workload. Busy operations may reduce opportunities for supervision. Limited equipment may encourage continued use of aging infrastructure. Again, this is not about criticism. It is about understanding reality. Supervision is another important organisational influence. Good supervision is one of the strongest safety barriers in any operation. It helps ensure procedures are followed, training standards remain consistent, changing conditions are recognised, and less experienced members receive appropriate support. Good supervision is proactive rather than reactive. It identifies developing risks before they result in occurrences. Poor supervision does not necessarily mean supervisors are careless. Often it reflects competing demands, excessive workload, or insufficient resources. So investigators should therefore ask not only whether supervision was adequate, but whether supervisors had the capacity to supervise effectively. Communication quality is another influence. Good communication is more than accurate radio calls. It includes briefings, debriefings, constructive feedback, sharing concerns, listening respectfully, and ensuring important information reaches the people who need it. Many investigations reveal that someone recognised the developing risk before the occurrence. The problem was not that the hazard went unnoticed. The problem was that the information was never effectively communicated. Sometimes people assumed somebody else already knew. Sometimes they felt uncomfortable speaking up. Sometimes previous concerns had been ignored, so they concluded that raising another concern would make little difference. Weak communication systems allow small problems to continue developing. When organisational influences become weak, unsafe norms can become accepted. Concerns may go unspoken, standards may gradually decline, risks may remain hidden, and learning opportunities may disappear. People may stop reporting hazards because previous reports produce no visible action. They may become reluctant to question experienced personnel. Over time, silence replaces communication. The organisation loses opportunities to identify risk early. So a strong organisational culture is itself a safety defence. It supports good decision making, it encourages open communication, it promotes effective supervision, it maintains professional standards, it identifies hazards early, and it continually reinforces safe behaviour. A professional investigation should therefore ask not only what happened or who made the final error, it should also ask what kind of organisation produced the conditions in which this occurrence became possible. When investigators answer that question honestly, they often identify improvements that strengthen the whole organisation, not just one individual's performance. One of the greatest challenges in aviation safety is that deterioration rarely happens all at once. It usually develops gradually. This process is often called cultural drift. Cultural drift occurs when organisations slowly move away from their intended standards without recognising that the change is occurring. Because each individual change appears small, it often is accepted without concern. Over time, those small changes accumulate. The process usually begins with intended standards. Procedures are clear, safety margins are appropriate, people understand the rules, the organisation operates as designed. Regular review and open discussion help keep those standards visible. Then small changes begin to appear. Perhaps a shortcut saves a little time. Perhaps someone decides a checklist is unnecessary for a routine task. Perhaps a briefing is shortened because everyone has heard it before. Each change appears harmless. Nothing bad happens. Because there are no immediate consequences, the behaviour begins to feel acceptable. Gradually, safety margins reduce. The operation still appears successful, flights continue safely, people become increasingly confident that shortcut is reasonable because it has worked before. Procedures then begin to stretch. Rules become more flexible. Documentation is no longer followed exactly. Local practices start replacing formal procedures. Eventually, what was originally an exception becomes normal practice. People no longer see the behaviour as unusual. New members simply learn that's how we do things here. That is why cultural drift is so dangerous. It hides itself. A familiar phrase in investigation is, "We've always done it this way." That statement often reflects genuine experience rather than deliberate carelessness, but familiarity can reduce questioning. When something has been done repeatedly without an accident, people naturally become more comfortable with it. The absence of previous accidents begins to feel like evidence that the practice is safe. In reality, it may simply mean the organisation has been fortunate. Safety margins rarely disappear overnight. They shrink one decision at a time. A slightly lower circuit, a slightly stronger crosswind, a slightly busier launch point, a slightly shorter briefing. Individually, each decision may appear reasonable. Collectively, they reduce organisational resilience. Procedural drift is another part of this process. Formal procedures are often developed carefully using previous experience and operational knowledge. But over time, people may begin adapting them. Steps are skipped, briefings become shorter, document falls behind operational practice. Eventually, written procedures no longer reflect how work is actually performed. For investigators, the important question is, was this behaviour unusual, or had it gradually become normal within the organisation? If several people were behaving similarly, the issue may not be an individual decision at all. It may indicate that the organisation itself has drifted away from intended standards. That is why periodic review is so valuable. External audits, independent observations, peer review, open safety discussions, and regular refresher training all help organisations compare current practice with intended standards before drift becomes significant. The objective is not to criticise experienced people. Experienced people often develop shortcuts because they are trying to improve efficiency or solve practical problems. The challenge is ensuring that those adaptations are examined carefully rather than accepted automatically. Healthy organisations regularly ask, are we still operating the way we intended? Have our local practices drifted from our documented procedures? Have we slowly accepted risks that would once have concerned us? Cultural drift is rarely dramatic. It develops slowly, often unnoticed by people involved. Awareness is therefore our strongest defence. By regularly reviewing procedures, encouraging open discussion, and remaining willing to question familiar practices, organisations can identify drift early and restore the safety margins that protect both people and operations. So now we've looked at how to investigate occurrences using modern human factors principles. The next question is, how do we communicate those findings so they actually improve safety? That is the purpose of a well-written SOAR report. A good report does far more than document what happened. It provides a clear explanation of the event, identifies contributing factors, captures lessons learned, and recommends practical actions to reduce the likelihood of recurrence. In other words, the report is the bridge between the investigation and safety improvement. Good reports need several qualities. First, they should be clear. Readers should understand what occurred and how the investigator reached their conclusions. They should be objective. The investigator's role is to evaluate evidence fairly, not defend a position. Reports should be well structured. Readers should be able to follow the path from facts through analysis to conclusions and recommendations. Reports should be evidence-based. Every significant conclusion should be supported by evidence. If the evidence is incomplete or uncertain, that uncertainty should be acknowledged. Finally, reports should be useful for learning. A technically accurate report has limited value if it does not help improve future operations. The SOAR structure helps achieve that. It begins with a clear description. This answers the question, what happened? The description should present the sequence of events clearly, accurately, and objectively. It should avoid opinion, assumption, or conclusion. The goal is simply to establish the facts. The next section is the analysis. Here we move beyond describing the event to asking, why did it happen? This is where the human factors concepts we have discussed become important. Rather than attributing the event to a single mistake, we examine the interaction of people, procedures, equipment, environment, and organisational influences. The report should then identify contributing factors. These are conditions that influence the outcome. Some may relate directly to the occurrence. Others may have existed in the background long before the event. Together, they explain how the circumstances aligned to create the occurrence. The report should also capture safety learning. A good investigation should leave the organisation with a better understanding of how to improve safety. The question is not only what went wrong, it is also what can we learn. Finally, the report should include recommendations. Recommendations should be practical, achievable, and directed towards strengthening the system. Rather than simply telling people to be more careful, good recommendations address underlying issues. They might improve procedures, strengthen supervision, clarify responsibilities, enhance training, improve communication, or reinforce safety barriers. There are also some common traps to avoid. The first is emotional language. Expressions of frustration, criticism, or approval have no place in a professional investigation report. The second is blame language. Statements such as the pilot caused the accident or the instructor failed often oversimplify complex events. Instead, investigators should describe behaviours, decisions, and contributing factors objectively. The third is speculation. Investigators should not fill gaps in the evidence with assumptions. If something cannot be established, it is better to say so. Recognising uncertainty is a strength, not a weakness. Another trap is advocacy. A safety report is not an argument. Its purpose is not to justify a predetermined conclusion. It is to explain the evidence fairly. Finally, avoid unclear reasoning. Readers should be able to understand how the investigation moved from evidence to conclusion. A useful principle is describe the facts analyse the evidence, explain the reasoning, share the learning. If those elements are present, the report is far more likely to support genuine safety improvement. One important principle of professional safety investigation is proportionality. Not every occurrence requires the same level of investigation. A minor operational event involving little risk and limited learning potential does not require the same resources as a serious accident or high potential incident. Good investigators match the depth of the investigation to the significance of the occurrence. Investigation depth should increase with operational significance. At the lower end are occurrences of very low significance. These may only require a brief review to establish what happened, identify any immediate safety concerns, and decide whether future action is needed. Low significance events may require a little more review, especially where there is some uncertainty, a repeat pattern, or a possible lesson for local operations. Moderate events require more detailed review. This may involve interviewing participants, examining records, reviewing procedures, identifying contributing factors, and considering whether broader organisational issues are present. High significant events justify the greatest investigative effort. These may involve systematic evidence gathering, detailed human factors analysis, examination of organisational influences, and carefully developed safety recommendations. The important point is that proportionality does not mean reducing professional standards. A short investigation should still be conducted professionally. It should still follow logical process. It should still distinguish fact from opinion, and it should still document the reasoning behind its conclusions. The difference is the depth of the investigation, not the quality. There are 4 useful principles. First, match operational significance. Focus effort where the actual or potential consequences are the greatest. A seemingly minor event may deserve attention if it reveals a systemic weakness that can contribute to something more serious. Second, match safety value. Some investigations provide limited learning because the causes are already well understood. Others reveal new hazards, emerging trends, or weaknesses in organisational systems. Effort should be directed where it is likely to produce the greatest safety benefit. Third, remain systematic. Even a brief review should gather the available evidence, identify contributing factors where appropriate, and record the basis for any conclusions. And finally, remain evidence-based. The quality of an investigation is determined by the quality of its evidence, not by the length of this report. If the evidence is limited, the report should acknowledge those limitations rather than speculate. A practical way to think about proportionality is this. Investigate deeply enough to understand the safety issues, but not so deeply that resources are wasted without producing additional learning. Every investigation, regardless of size, should remain disciplined, systematic, and grounded in evidence. Even experienced investigators can undermine an otherwise good investigation through poor report writing. Most problems are not caused by lack of technical knowledge. They arise because the report fails to communicate the evidence clearly, objectively, and logically. The first common problem is emotional language. Words such as careless, reckless, obviously, clearly, or should have known express judgment rather than evidence. They often create defensiveness and reduce confidence in the report. Professional investigators describe observable facts and allow the evidence to support the conclusions. The second problem is speculation. Sometimes investigators fill gaps in the evidence with assumptions. Phrases as probably happened, must have been, or it is likely may be appropriate if clearly identified as an influence, but speculation should never be presented as established fact. When evidence is incomplete, the report should acknowledge the uncertainty. The third problem is missing or poorly constructed timeline. Time is often one of the most important elements of an investigation. A clear sequence of events helps readers understand how the occurrence developed, how decisions were made, and how conditions changed. Without a logical timeline, the investigation can become confusing, and important relationships between events may be overlooked. The fourth problem is blame language. The purpose of a safety investigation is not to allocate blame. Statements such as the pilot caused the accident or the instructor failed rarely improve safety. Instead, the report should explain what actions occurred, what conditions influenced those actions, and what factors contributed to the outcome. The final issue is poor analysis structure. One of the most common mistakes is mixing facts, assumptions, opinions, and recommendations together. When this happens, readers struggle to distinguish what is known, what has been inferred, and what actions are proposed. A well-structured report separates these elements clearly. It begins with facts. It then moves to analysis, explaining what the evidence suggests and why. Finally, it provides recommendations that are directly linked to the findings. A useful discipline when writing any investigation report is to continually ask, am I describing a fact? Am I explaining an analysis? Or am I making a recommendation? If those elements remain clearly separated, the report will usually be easier to understand and more credible. The purpose of an investigation report is not simply to record what happened. Its purpose is to help others understand the event, learn from it, and improve future safety. A good report should provide clear facts, logical analysis, and practical recommendations. We've now discussed the principles of good report writing. This exercise gives us an opportunity to apply those principles by critically reviewing a report. Importantly, we're not analysing the occurrence itself, we're analysing the quality of the investigation report. The extract on the left-hand side of the slide has been deliberately written poorly. It contains many problems we have discussed throughout the workshop. Please take a few minutes to read the report extract. All right, so before we critique the report, Dave is going to launch the quick Teams poll. What is the biggest improvement needed in this report extract? And the options are going to be replace opinions with evidence, remove blame language, add missing facts and context, clarify the timeline, support conclusion with evidence, improve recommendations, all of above. So you've got the poll there. I'll give you about 20 seconds.
Okay.
Okay, so what's the consensus there, Dave?
Yep, most of it is all of the above. Coming in on the chat for sure, and based on whatever's coming in on the actual exercise. So all of the above.
Yep, so that's the best answer, all of the above. And that is deliberate. This extract is not weak in just one area. It contains several common report writing problems that can undermine safety learning. Opinion presented as fact, blame language, missing context, an unclear timeline, unsupported conclusions, and recommendations that are not well linked to systems improvement. So remember this, the purpose of the exercise is not to criticise the fictional pilot, nor is it to decide whether the conclusions are correct. Our task is simply to ask, is this a well-written investigation report? So if we identify the issues, the first is speculation. For example, the report says the pilot was obviously getting too low. How do we know that? What evidence supports that statement? What was the height measured? Who observed it? The report also says the pilot simply misjudged it. That may eventually prove to be true, but no evidence is presented to support that conclusion. Good reports distinguish clearly between evidence and interpretation. The second issue is blame language. Examples include poor decision, should have known better, poor airmanship, failure to fly a proper circuit. Those expressions are emotionally loaded. They encourage readers to stop thinking rather than continue investigating. Professional investigators replace judgment with objective descriptions supported by the evidence. The third issue is missing facts. Before drawing conclusions, we would normally expect information such as aircraft type, weather and wind conditions, pilot experience, sequence of events, witness observations, radio calls, and the pilot's own account. Without those facts, readers cannot independently assess the analysis. The fourth issue is an unclear timeline. Does the report explain how the event developed? Not really. We do not know exactly when the aircraft became low. We do not know what happened beforehand. We do not know whether conditions changed during the circuit. We do not know whether there were opportunities to intervene. Without a clear timeline, it becomes difficult to understand how the occurrence unfolded. The fifth issue is unsupported conclusions. The report states the accident was caused by poor airmanship. That's a conclusion, but where is the supporting analysis? How did the investigator eliminate weather, workload, supervision, training, or other contributing factors? Professional reports explain how the evidence leads to conclusions. So, as for the recommendations in here, the report suggests reminding pilots not to fly bad circuits and questioning whether the pilot should continue flying solo. They're not really useful, those recommendations. The first recommendation is vague. The second focuses on individual rather than the system. And good recommendations should be specific, practical, achievable, and directly linked to the investigation findings. They might address instructor supervision, early solo monitoring, circuit decision making, wind briefings, or additional training. So if we move to the improvement task shown on the bottom of the slide, how could this report be improved? Well, we start with the facts. What observable information should be added? Is there enough evidence? Have assumptions been avoided? Next, think about the timeline. Would presenting the events in a chronological order make the report easy to understand? Then consider the context. What operational conditions, pressures, or background information might help explain the pilot's decisions? Ask yourself whether the report analyses the evidence or simply assigns blame. Are the conclusions supported by the facts? And finally, are the recommendations practical? Will they improve safety for everyone rather than simply criticising one individual? If there was one improvement you would like to make the report, it could be a fact that should be added, wording that should be changed, a conclusion that needs stronger evidence, or a recommendation that could be made useful. I was going to make this interactive, but I think I might just skip that section. So good reporting improves safety. Clear, objective, and balanced reports help everyone learn and prevent future accidents. Okay, we'll move on. As we approach the end of this course, it is important to recognise that not every occurrence can or should be investigated solely within the club or Gliding Australia. More serious occurrences often involve other organisations, each with different responsibilities, legal powers, and objectives. Understanding those roles helps ensure investigations remain professional, cooperative, and effective. First, there is the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, or the ATSB. The ATSB is Australia's independent transport safety investigator. Its purpose is not to apportion blame or determine liability. Its role is to investigate significant occurrences, understand what happened, identify contributing factors, and make safety recommendations aimed at preventing similar events in the future. If the ATSB commences an investigation, clubs and Gliding Australia would cooperate fully while recognising that the ATSB controls its own investigation. Next is CASA, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. CASA is Australia's aviation regulator. Its role is different from ATSB. CASA is responsible for regulatory oversight, certification, compliance, and where appropriate, enforcement. ATSB investigates for safety learning. CASA regulates compliance with aviation legislation. Understanding that distinction is important. Gliding Australia will usually liaise with CASA only in relation to serious accidents, so that CASA is aware of the occurrence early and does not first learn of it through media or other informal channels. Clubs are not normally expected to contact CASA directly, as this liaison is generally managed by Gliding Australia. Gliding Australia may also escalate a matter to CASA where there appears to be a regulatory breach that Gliding Australia is unable to manage internally. In some cases, CASA may contact Gliding Australia after receiving glider accident or incident reports from the ATSB or Air Services Australia, or where CASA requires additional information or regulatory follow-up. In some serious occurrences, police and emergency services may be the first external authorities on scene, even before any aviation investigation activity begins. Police do not conduct aviation safety investigations. Where there has been a fatality or serious injury, their role is primarily to support the coronial and legal process. This may include preserving the scene, identifying the deceased, notifying the next of kin, gathering information for the coroner, and dealing with any suspected criminal matters. Emergency services have a separate and immediate role. Their priority is rescue, medical care, fire suppression, and making the scene safe. Investigation consideration should never delay emergency response. Once the scene is safe, investigation activity can begin in accordance with the responsibilities of the appropriate authority. This preserves the key practical points while avoiding the impression that police investigate the aviation causes. Australian coronial material describes police as gathering initial information for the coroner after a death, while the ATSB is Australia's National Transport Safety Investigator. Finally, there is Gliding Australia. Gliding Australia's responsibilities include internal occurrence investigation, safety management, organisational learning, and improving operational safety across the gliding community. Most club-level investigations will occur within this framework. However, where external agencies become involved, Gliding Australia works alongside them while respecting their separate responsibilities. The important principle is this: every organisation involved has a different purpose. One may be focused on rescue, another on regulation, another on legal processes, another on organisational learning. Those purposes should complement one another, not compete with one another. It is also important to recognise the limitations of club investigations. Club investigators are not police investigators. They are not ATSB investigators. They do not have statutory power to compel interviews, seize evidence, or determine legal liability. Their role is to gather factual information, analyse contributing factors within their authority, support organisational learning, and cooperate professionally with any external agency involved. During a serious occurrence, professionalism matters enormously. This means preserving evidence where appropriate, maintaining accurate records, avoiding speculation, respecting confidentiality, cooperating with external authorities, and allowing each organisation to fulfil its own role. Attempts to conduct parallel investigations, assign blame publicly, or interfere with another agency's work can undermine both the safety, learning, and public confidence. The key message is simple: know your responsibilities, understand your limitations, cooperate professionally, stay focused on safety and learning. Effective investigations depend on respectful cooperation between clubs, Gliding Australia, the ATSB, CASA, police, and emergency services. When every organisation understands its role and works collaboratively, the outcome is a more thorough investigation, stronger safety learning, and a safer aviation system. As we conclude this course, it is worth recognising that investigating a serious occurrence is about far more than collecting evidence and writing reports. Serious investigations affect people. They affect families, witnesses, instructors, club members, investigators, and organisations. The technical investigation is only one part of the challenge. The human side is just as important. So is teamwork. Serious investigations are rarely managed well by one person acting alone. Different people bring different skills, perspectives, and experience, and working together improves both the quality of the investigation and the well-being of those involved. One of the first pressures is media attention. Significant aviation occurrences can attract intense public interest. News reports may appear quickly. Social media can spread information and misinformation even faster. Investigators and club personnel may feel pressure to provide immediate answers. However, good investigations take time. It is always better to say we are gathering the facts than to speculate or provide premature conclusions. Serious occurrences also involve stress and trauma. Pilots, instructors, witnesses, family members, and rescue personnel may all experience significant psychological effects. Even people who are not directly involved may feel deeply affected, particularly within close-knit gliding clubs. Everyone responds differently. Some people want to talk immediately, others may need time before they are ready. Part of professional investigation is recognising those differences and treating everyone with empathy and respect. There may also be grief, guilt, self-doubt, anger, or emotional overload. People may replay events repeatedly and wonder whether they could have prevented the outcome. These reactions are normal. Investigators should avoid interpreting emotional responses as evidence of fault or responsibility. Emotions are a natural response to traumatic events. Another challenge is public scrutiny. Club members, the aviation community, and sometimes the wider public all want answers. When information is incomplete, speculation often fills the gaps. Rumours can spread rapidly. Professional investigators avoid contributing to that speculation. They remain patient, evidence-based, and objective, even when others are demanding immediate conclusions. Serious investigations also involve organisational sensitivity. An accident may affect the reputation of a club or organisation. There may be legal implications, insurance considerations, and operational consequences. Those pressures are real. However, they must never influence the integrity of the investigation. Safety investigations exist to improve future safety, not to protect reputations or assign blame. It is also important to remember that investigators themselves are not immune to these pressures. Reading distressing material, interviewing traumatised people, and examining serious accidents can have a cumulative psychological impact. Recognising your own limitations is a sign of professionalism, not weakness. If you are becoming emotionally affected, seek support, share responsibilities, and take appropriate breaks. Good investigators look after themselves as well as others. Finally, remember that the people involved in an occurrence are not simply sources of information. They may be experiencing one of the most difficult events of their lives. Treat them with dignity, listen carefully, respect confidentiality, allow the evidence, not assumptions or emotions, to guide conclusions. Professionalism includes compassion. The key message is this: support people, work together, know your limits. When organisations care for both the quality of the investigation and the well-being of those affected, they create the strongest foundation for learning, recovery, and future safety improvement. Investigation is not the end of the safety process. In many ways, it's the beginning. The true value of an investigation is not the report itself. Its value lies in what people learn and what they change afterwards. If lessons remain in a filing cabinet or on a server that no one reads, the opportunity to improve safety has been lost. Effective safety organisations treat every occurrence as an opportunity to learn. That learning follows a cycle. We report what happened. We analyse the occurrence to understand why it happened. We discuss the findings openly. We learn from the experience. And then we improve procedures, training, supervision, or systems. That improvement strengthens future operations and encourages further reporting. In this way, safety becomes a continuous cycle rather than a one-off event. One of the most effective ways to share learning is through safety briefings. Briefings allow clubs and organisations to communicate key lessons quickly and consistently. They reinforce good practices, highlight emerging risks, and remind people that incidents are valuable learning opportunities, not reasons for embarrassment. Short, regular safety briefings often have more impact than lengthy reports that few people read. Trend analysis is another valuable tool. A single incident may appear isolated, but when several similar reports are examined together, important patterns often emerge. Perhaps several pilots are experiencing the same difficulty. Perhaps a procedure is causing confusion. Perhaps a change in local operations has gradually increased workload. Looking for trends allows organisations to identify hazards before they result in a serious accident. Instructor discussions are equally important. Many valuable lessons are shared informally between instructors and experienced pilots. Open discussions of incidents or near misses helps improve judgment, encourages reflection, and allows practical experience to be passed on to others. The aim is not to criticise those involved. It is to help everyone become safer. Case studies are another powerful learning tool. Real events show us how to explore how multiple factors interacted in genuine operational situations. Case studies encourage discussion rather than memorisation. Instead of asking what rule was broken, they ask what can we learn. That approach develops understanding, judgment, and risk awareness. Finally, organisations benefit from shared learning. Safety knowledge should not remain within one instructor, one club, or one investigation team. Sharing lessons across clubs, regions, and the wider gliding community strengthens safety for everyone. One occurrence at one airfield may prevent a similar occurrence somewhere else. That is one of the greatest strengths of an open reporting culture. None of this works unless people are willing to report honestly. People report when they believe their reports will lead to meaningful improvement. They stop reporting when they believe reports simply lead to blame, criticism, or punishment. A healthy reporting culture is built on trust. That trust depends on investigators being objective, respectful, and focused on learning. So as we reach the end of this course, remember the central message. Every incident, whether large or small, is an opportunity to improve safety. When we report openly, investigate professionally, analyse thoughtfully, and share what we learn, we strengthen the safety of the entire organisation. That is the purpose of investigation. Not simply to explain what happened, but to help ensure it is less likely to happen again. So as we conclude this workshop series, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Every investigation is a choice. We can choose to look for someone to blame, or we can choose to understand how the system allowed the event to occur and how we can make that system safer. The first approach ends with criticism. The second leads to learning. Professional investigators choose understanding because understanding is what prevents future accidents. Across both presentations, several important themes should now stand out clearly. The first is learning over blame. Few accidents are fully explained by looking only at the individual involved. Real safety improvement comes from understanding the conditions, decisions, equipment, environment, and organisational influence that shape the outcome. When investigations focus on learning rather than fault, organisations become stronger, more open, and more resilient. The second theme is systems thinking. Human performance never occurs in isolation. People work within procedures, equipment, environments, and organisations. The models we have discussed, including the Shell model, remind us that the accidents usually result from multiple interacting factors, not a single isolated error. The third theme is evidence-based analysis. Professional investigations are built on facts, not assumptions. They remain objective, acknowledge uncertainty where it exists, and distinguish clearly between facts, analysis, and opinion. They explain not only what happened, but why the available evidence supports the conclusions reached. Professionalism has also been a recurring theme. Good investigators demonstrate discipline, integrity, and fairness. They respect the people involved. They communicate clearly. They remain open to new evidence. And they understand that credibility of an investigation depends as much on its process as on its conclusions. Perhaps most importantly, strong safety culture depends on trust. People must feel confident that reported hazards, incidents, and mistakes will lead to learning, not unfair criticism. Trust encourages reporting. Reporting generates information. Information enables learning, and learning drives safer operations. Finally, remember that safety is never finished. Every report, every discussion, every occurrence, and every investigation provides another opportunity to improve. Small improvements made consistently over time strengthen operational resilience and reduce future risk. This workshop series has been built around practical aviation occurrence investigation manual that I have written. Following this workshop, the manual will be made available through Gliding Australia so participants can download it and use it as a continuing reference for their own clubs and organisations. So whether you're investigating a minor occurrence, reviewing a safety report, mentoring another pilot, or leading a club safety program, I encourage you to apply the principles we've discussed. Be curious, seek evidence, think systematically, treat people with fairness and respect. And always ask, what can we learn today that will make tomorrow's flight safer? Thank you for your participation, your discussion, and your commitment to improving aviation safety. Every investigation is an opportunity to improve systems, strengthen operational awareness, support affected people, and help prevent future actions. Thank you, and fly safely.
Thank you, Chris. What a great 2 evenings we've had. There's been an incredible amount of information you've provided with us, and if there's any questions that anybody's got, they can put them into the Q&A, not the chat, please, because the chat becomes very, very chaotic as everybody's thanking you, Chris, for what you've done. So we'll just wait for a minute or two and just see if there's any important questions. I'll reiterate that the manual that Chris has written is Chris has kindly donated that now to Gliding Australia, and that will be available shortly for downloading from the website. An email will go out with that. This video this presentation has now been created as a video, and it will be up on our Gliding Australia YouTube account, the same as part 1 was. Looking at what's been happening, I can't see any questions there, Chris.
Right.
Once again, love to thank you for what you've done. Lots of thanks coming in there. I'll end the event now. If you want to stay on